All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Torah studies. This week's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Tazria Metzora. But before we get into the Torah portion, it's important to mention that tonight is actually a very special Hasidic holiday, an auspicious day on the Hasidic calendar. That is the day of Beis Iyar, the second day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, which is the birthday of the Rebbe Maharash, the fourth Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel Schneerson of Lubavitch. He was born back in the 19th century, and he's famous for his motto, with which he lives by and encouraged others to live by. And as a matter of fact, the Rebbe took that motto and ran with it. And the motto was Lechatchila Ariber, which means that from the get-go, we got to soar over, we got to go over it. And what he was referencing was the idea that when we encounter challenges, some of us wait for the challenges to come, and then we start grappling with the challenges. We try to circumvent the challenges. We try to go under it. And the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, said, and I say that when you encounter challenges, just go right over them. Do what you got to do, and everything will fall into place. And so it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor. It's definitely a perfect way to go at life. And that is the way Nike says, just do it. We encounter a mitzvah, and we have all different types of ideas and challenges that seem to go against this mitzvah that we'd like to perform. What does the Rebbe Maharash teach us? He teaches us the Chatchila Ariber, just go ahead and do it, and don't worry all the challenges. You don't have to grapple with them. You don't have to deal with them. They will fall on the wayside. And so it's definitely an important aspect of how to see life, and it fits right in with tonight's Torah class on the idea within this week's Torah portion that we will be dwelling upon. But before we get to this week's Torah, before we get to the lesson and the nugget that we will glean from this week's Torah portion, now let's go to an overview of this week's Torah portion that will give us a general insight on the Torah portion this week. Important to note that this week is not just one Torah portion, rather it is two Torah portions. It is Tazria and Metzora. The reason why some weeks we have two Torah portions, as I've explained in the past, is that there are 54 Torah portions, and there are only 52 weeks in a solar year and 48 weeks in a lunar year, or 50 weeks in a lunar year. And so how do we complete the entire Torah within 1 year, as well as some holidays? If the day of the holiday is on Shabbat, we don't read a Torah portion, we read an area of the Torah associated with that holiday. And so how do we complete the entire Torah? Some weeks, like this week, we double up, and we read 2 of the 54 Torah portions. And so this week we have a double Torah portion, and they are actually connected, Tazria and Metzora. Here's the parsha overview. The Torah portions of Tazria and Metzora continue the discussion of the laws of Tuma v'Tahara, ritual impurity and purity. A woman giving birth should undergo a process of purification, which includes immersing in a mikveh, a naturally gathered pool of water, and bringing offerings to the holy temple. The Torah portion then continues that all male infants are to be circumcised on the 8th day of life, the mitzvah of bris milah, brit milah. The Torah portion then continues. Tzarat, often mistranslated as leprosy, is a supernatural plague that can afflict people as well as garments or homes. If white or pink patches appear on a person's skin, dark pink or dark green on garments or homes, a Kohen is summoned. Judging by various signs, such as an increase in size of the afflicted area after a 7-day quarantine, we're familiar with that term, the Kohen pronounces it tameh, impure, or tahor, pure. And that's actually what the name of the second Torah portion, Tzarat, Metzora, gets its name from. Tzarat is the leprosy, this supernatural leprosy, not leprosy as we know it. And Metzora is one who is afflicted with this disease. A person afflicted with Tzarat must dwell alone outside of the camp or city until he is healed. The afflicted area in a garment or home must be removed. If the tzarat recurs, the entire garment or home must be destroyed. Torah portion then continues, when the Metzora, the person who has tzarat, heals, he or she is purified by the Kohen with a special procedure involving 2 birds, spring water in an earthen vessel, a piece of cedar wood, a scarlet thread, and a bundle of hyssop. Ritual impurity is also engendered through a seminal or other discharge in a man, and menstruation or other discharge of blood in a woman, necessitating purification through immersion in a mikvah. There's definitely a lot to be discussed in these 2 Torah portions. As a matter of fact, this is my bar mitzvah Torah portion. It's long, if I recall correctly. It's 156 verses, but don't quote me on that. I would have to double check that. These 2 Torah portions combined have many, many detailed laws and complex ideas that are discussed throughout the Talmud of ritual impurity and purity. And so obviously there are many, many questions that you may have running through this overview, but we will not dwell upon all of that, because then we will be here until next year. So we've dwelled upon some of these ideas in past weeks. This week, we will actually dwell upon the mitzvah of circumcision, which, as noted, is towards the beginning of this week's 2 Torah portions. What about circumcision, and what can circumcision teach us, aside from the literal mitzvah that on the 8th day, a boy shall be circumcised? Which leads us to an interesting idea that each one of us encounters regularly. Self-help books. We're all familiar with them, right? 7 Habits of Great People and Tipping Point, and someone told me of another one today, I forget what it's called. There's all types of self-help books from throughout the ages and stages of people's lives that we go through. And we read the book, there are nice stories, there's nice anecdotes, there's positive ideas and great things that we want to implement in our lives. But then we say, you know what? For me to change my life, there is so much that has to go into it. Why bother? Why bother? Why even begin? Or, in the case of a diet, we get excited to go on a diet, we get involved, we start eating following a strict regimen, and after a short while later, we have that midnight binge in the closet that sets everything off course and actually sometimes sets us back from where we were. So the next time it arises in our mind and say, hey, I want to go on a diet, or I want to change myself, I want to better myself, we say, why bother? Remember last time I tried to do that? I didn't get too far. Not only I didn't get too far, but I got so fed up with it that I went backwards a little bit. Right, we come up with a great plan, and the quote that we had last week from one of a great general who said that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And the enemy can be whatever it may be. In this case, if it's a case of a diet, it's the food. If it's a case with self-help, it's our character traits, whatever it may be. We have this grand plan and we try to implement it, and bam, goes off the rails. And so the next time we come around and we say, why bother? Is there a way to stop that cycle? Is there a way to actually change ourselves? And when it comes to Judaism, we have that same question. What does Judaism tell us about changing ourselves and changing ourselves within Judaism? There's 2 reasons, general reasons, why people who want to get closer to their spiritual selves, who want to enhance their spiritual lives, there are 2 reasons why we won't do it. First off, we may see that an authentic Torah lifestyle is something which is way beyond us. It's something which is beyond and unattainable. It's grand, it's big, there's so much to do, there are so many details, it's not for me. Another reason that may set us off course is that even if we know that we're doomed to mediocrity, we're not going to be that perfect, but we're going to start, maybe we should go small steps, but we become intimidated by these small steps because we say, hey, we're not cutting it either way. We're not reaching where we ought to be, so why bother even with the small steps? Is there a way that we can avoid that mindset, especially in areas of Judaism? Is there something that the Torah tells us with regard to this idea? And that's where circumcision comes in. Here's a quote. Here's the quote from this week's Torah portion, text 1a. If you have the student book, I apologize. Someone pointed out that in the email that linked to the student book from the first season. Now we are in season 3, sorry. It linked to season 1 and it's for season 3. So I apologize if you've ordered it. And God willing, in next week's email, that link will be updated. If you have the student book, it's on page 15. Quote from this week's Torah portion, the book of Leviticus, the Torah portion of Tazria. Chapter 12, verse 3, on the 8th day, and on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Straightforward. 8th day, circumcise the male. But there's something unique in this wording. Everything in Torah is precise. And on the 8th day. In Torah grammar, that's out of place. Where do we see that? Here's a quote from the Talmud, from the Midrash. On the 8th day, one might assume that it may be performed either on the 8th day or on its preceding night. To clarify, the Torah adds on the 8th day that it must be performed during the day. Torah is telling us day, not on the 8th. Sometimes a verse just tells us on the 8th. And then we know that it's referring to any time of the 8th day, the 24-hour period, the night preceding the day, according to Torah, the 24-hour period. So when can we perform circumcision? If it said on the 8th, I would have thought on the 8th, anytime in the 24-hour period, even the night preceding. Comes the Torah and tells us, no, on the 8th day, it has to be during the daytime. All right. However, this only teaches that an 8-day-old newborn must be circumcised by day. But how about one who is circumcised on day 9, 10, or 11? From where do we know that a delayed brit may also not be performed at night? A delayed brit is not so common, but it's not so uncommon. If for whatever reason the mole says, or the doctor says the baby isn't ready, isn't healthy enough, the bilirubin number is too high, the babies don't weigh enough. There are many scenarios when we wait. We don't do it on the 8th day for the health and safety of the baby. Sometimes we wait a full month for the bris, sometimes 6 weeks, depending on the situation. And so maybe such a bris may be at the night, doesn't have to be during the day. So the Midrash continues. To resolve this, the Torah adds, and on the 8th day. The and on addition, it could have just said on the 8th day. Why does it say and on the 8th day? To imply and teach us that not only a 8th day bris has to be during the day, but and there is an additional time that it always has to be during the day, and that's even when the bris is not in its correct time. That's what the Midrash teaches us, which is why the custom is to do a bris milah as early as possible during the day, because it's a mitzvah and we'd like to honor the mitzvah by performing the mitzvah as early as possible. So the next time you're invited to a bris at 7 a.m., know that there's a reason for it and why it's not being done at 6 p.m. So we have here clearly that the bris milah should be done during the day, which leads us to a slight issue. And that takes us back to the period when this mitzvah was given. Shortly before this period was the Exodus. And here's the story, what happened at the time of the Exodus, just before Exodus. The Jewish people have just witnessed God bring the 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. It's now the time for the 10th plague, the plague of the killing of the firstborns. And God has commanded the Jewish people to bring the paschal sacrifice and to eat matzah. We're going to read a medrash that tells us that the Jews were almost prevented from partaking in the paschal sacrifice, that they were commanded to bring and to eat and to enjoy from. Why were they prevented or almost prevented? Here's the Midrash that tells us a little story, a little background. The Holy One, blessed be He, wished to redeem the Israelites, but they lacked merit. What did God do? He called to Moses and said to him, go circumcise them. Go circumcise the Jewish people. Still, many would not commit to undergo the circumcision. To motivate them, God instructed them to prepare the paschal offering. All right, go ahead, go to that next step, go and prepare the paschal sacrifice. When Moses prepared the offering, God decreed upon the four winds of the world, and they blew into the Garden of Eden. At his behest, these winds imbued the aromas of Eden into the smell of Moses' offering. Consequently, all the Israelites, faint with craving for the heavenly meat, gathered before Moses, saying, we beg of you, please let us eat of your paschal offering that smells like heaven. Literally in this case. I wonder if this is where it comes from. In Moses, your paschal offering smells like heaven. It smells delicious. Let us eat it. And God said, if you do not become circumcised, you shall not eat of this meat. As the verse relates at the beginning of the book of Exodus, God said to Moses and Aaron, this is the decree of the paschal offering. No one uncircumcised may eat from it. So the Jewish people, not having a choice, they want to partake of this heavenly paschal sacrifice with the aromas of Eden. What do? Immediately they gave themselves over and underwent circumcision, and the blood thereof mingled with the blood of the paschal offering. God then passed among the people and picked each one up, kissing and blessing them. The same story is told elsewhere in the Midrash with an additional detail. Text 2b, page 17. The Israelites said, Moses, our teacher, give us something we can eat. And he answered them, God said to me, as a rule, no uncircumcised male may eat of the paschal offerings. Immediately, every one of the Israelites placed his sword upon his thigh and circumcised himself. When did this story take place? This story took place in the evening. Moses had prepared his paschal sacrifice. The paschal sacrifice was brought in the evening. And the eating of the paschal sacrifice was specifically at night. So when did the Jewish people go ahead and circumcise themselves for the first time in Egypt? That first time they were commanded to be circumcised? At night. Didn't we just come to conclusion, come to the understanding that circumcision has to be during the day? Now, granted that halachically, according to Jewish law, the Jewish people were not bound by these obligations until after the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So Exodus took place roughly 2 months, 7 weeks before the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So it won't be for another 7 weeks that Jewish people are bound by these rules of circumcision only being during the day and not at night. True. But from a philosophical perspective, theological perspective, if God wants that the circumcision should be done by day, there must be a reason behind it. And if there's a reason behind it, shouldn't have God orchestrated that this story take place during the day so the Jewish people would go ahead and circumcise themselves during the day? Why do it in a way that the circumcision should take place at night? In the words of the Rebbe, text 3, this story needs clarification. Granted, inasmuch as this was before Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Jews were still allowed to circumcise at night, as it wasn't yet prohibited. But on a deeper level, why would God specifically orchestrate the event to take place at night? The Midrash describes many uncircumcised Jews being miraculously compelled to perform the bris by God decreeing upon the four winds of the world, causing an irresistible fragrance to be exuded from Moses' paschal lamb. Why then couldn't the same or a similar miracle have been orchestrated by God so that the Jews would be told no one uncircumcised may eat from it and perform the mitzvah properly during the day? If it's supernatural, these smells of paradise is what got if these supernatural smells, aromas of paradise is what got the Jewish people to go ahead and fulfill God's command of circumcising themselves, couldn't have God brought those aromas during the daytime? As a question is asked, this same question by the famed 16th century sage, they immediately circumcised themselves. Wasn't it forbidden to perform a bris at night? Also, that night was Passover. How then could they have violated the holiday, as only a timely circumcision of an 8-day-old may violate Shabbos and Yom Tov? So we have this obvious question. Why? Why did God orchestrate in a way that the Jewish people should perform circumcision at night? Even more than that, this circumcision was a commandment that was a prerequisite for the Jewish people to eat the Paschal sacrifice and to be redeemed. Why didn't God let them know about it earlier? Why did he wait until this moment at night? It's not like they had a choice. Earlier in the day, they didn't even know that it was a prerequisite for them to be circumcised. Why not? Why did God wait till night to tell them that circumcision is a prerequisite? That's when they were first commanded. And so to understand this question, we have to understand a little bit deeper about the mitzvah of circumcision in general. Here's an interesting story about the power of bris milah and the lengths that the Jewish people would go to perform that mitzvah. These stories, this is a story back from the 2nd century, from the famed Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the Prince, the writer of the Mishnah. But the story repeated itself countless times of Jews putting their life on the line to perform circumcision during the daytime, during times of happiness, and during the nighttime, during times of darkness. Not literally night, but during the times of darkness, when the fulfillment of circumcision was outlawed. Up until recently, in the former Soviet Union, and even nowadays, there are people that put their lives on the line to go ahead and be circumcised. Why is circumcision such an important mitzvah that the Jewish people put their life on the line? Here's a story of Rabbi Judah the Prince, one of the greatest sages of all times. Our sages taught once the Romans forbade the circumcision of Jewish boys. And it was at that time that Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Judah the Prince, this is taking place in the 2nd century, was born. His father, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was a leader of the Jewish people at the time, said, God commanded us to perform the circumcision, the bris, and these evildoers decree that we may not. How can we put off God's decree and carry out the whims of some evil man? And like that, he defiantly performed the circumcision. Before long, the Romans found out, and Rabbi Shimon was ordered to appear before the Roman governor of his town. Why did you violate the emperor's edict? Asked the frustrated governor. Rabbi Gamliel replied simply, this is what God commanded. This is what God commanded. Listen, said the governor, I have much respect for you, as you are your people's leader. But inasmuch as your act directly violated an imperial edict, I cannot let this pass. Do as you please, was the rabbi's response. What do you want me to do? I've decided to send you, your wife, and your circumcised child to the emperor, replied the Roman. He will decide what to do to you. Rabbi Shimon and his wife set out on the long journey to the imperial court. After traveling for a whole day, they arrived at a hotel owned by Severus, the father of Antoninus, who had also just been born. Rabbi Shimon's wife and the non-Jewish hostess soon began talking. "What brings you here?" she asked. The rabbi's wife told her the truth. "I just circumcised my son, and now I, my husband, and my newborn are being sent to Rome, where we will likely be killed." Upon hearing this, the horrified hostess immediately offered to exchange her son, Antoninus, for Rabbi Shimon's baby, Yehuda. She gratefully accepted the offer and continued on the journey with the uncircumcised baby while leaving her son behind in the care of the kind hostess. Upon their arrival in Rome by the emperor, they were shown into the emperor's court and found their town's governor already there. "This woman violated the emperor's decree and circumcised her child," he accused. "I have now brought them here. Please do with her as you wish." Upon hearing the charges, the emperor ordered the baby examined. Obviously, there was no sign that a circumcision had been performed. "I decreed against circumcision, and you have brought me an untouched baby?" raged the emperor. Some dignitaries familiar with the story who were also present came to the defense of the governor. "We can attest that this baby was circumcised, but these Jews are close to their God, and when they call, he answers." The emperor summarily had the accusing governor executed, rescinded the decree forbidding circumcision, and sent the Jewish couple away in peace. When they exchanged back their children, Antoninus' mother said, "Since a miracle was performed through me and my son for you and your son, let us and our children remain friends forever," which is indeed what happened. On account of the breast milk that Antoninus nursed from Rabbeinu HaKadosh, his mother, from Rabbi Yehuda, the prince's mother, he merited to wait upon the eventual leader of the Jewish people and to study Torah from him. Eventually, this little Antoninus, he became emperor and is said to have inherited a place in the world to come. So it's a little history piece of the Roman emperor during the 2nd century, Antoninus, and his early beginnings of being switched with a Jewish child. But the point of the story is how far a Jewish family was willing to go to sacrifice their life for circumcision. Let's think for a minute. What is it about circumcision, about bris milah, that the Jewish people have refused to part with? What's so special about it? And seemingly, objectively, it seems like it's the last mitzvah that's unanimously observed by everyone, by all families, all Jewish families. What's so significant about seemingly insignificant mitzvah? So the first point, the first argument we can make is that bris milah is arguably the most transformative mitzvah one can do. Take, for example, tefillin. When we put on tefillin, what are we doing? We're taking the hide of an animal with mixed berries that were made into ink or whatever other materials are used to make that ink. And we're transforming the item into something holy. It's so holy that not only while laying tefillin, but even after the tefillin has been removed, the tefillin cannot be discarded. It has to be buried. It's holy. The physical item has now transformed into a holy item. How much more so by the commandment of milah, of circumcision. We are transforming ourselves into a holy item. We are now holy by performing a mitzvah with our very flesh. It's the most transformative mitzvah. That seems to be this idea that the Jewish people have been so connected with this commandment throughout all ages, through the dark and through the light, through the trials and tribulations of all our history. In this mitzvah, in this transformative mitzvah, this so unique mitzvah, there are two important elements to this mitzvah. The first element is removing the foreskin, the literal circumcision, removing the foreskin. Here's a text from the beginning of Deuteronomy that gives us some insight into why this element is so major in this mitzvah. You shall circumcise the arla, the foreskin of your heart, and no more shall you be stiff-necked. And Rashi, our favorite commentary, explains, the arla of your heart refers to the blockage and covering of the heart. It turns out that milah, circumcision, literal circumcision, is a physical representation of removing the spiritual blockage that we have within ourselves, that we are born, we're naturally predisposed to ignore God, to ignore holiness, to ignore spirituality. That's why the removal of the foreskin is so important, because it's symbolic of something much deeper, much greater. It represents, it's not just symbolic, it represents something much greater, much deeper. Which brings us to the point, a very telling point, that women are not commanded to circumcise themselves. Aside from the technical difficulties of that, the Talmud makes a point to say that women are not obligated to circumcise themselves because it is as if they have already been circumcised. Not that it's not pertinent to them, not that it's not applicable to them, but it's as if they have already been circumcised. What does that mean? Understanding this idea of removal of the foreskin, understanding this idea that it's representative of the removal of the spiritual blockage. That's because the Jewish women have always been the moral voice for our nation. Jewish women have always been at the helm of leading the spiritual aspect of the Jewish nation. Beginning from way back when God tells Abraham to heed Sarah's voice over his own opinion and judgment. Follow what Sarah says. And throughout our history, throughout all of our history, even in times of Egypt, in the times of Egypt, the Talmud tells us that we merited to be redeemed from Egypt in the merit of the Jewish women. Because the Jewish women, as the Talmud says, it's as if they are already circumcised. In other words, they don't have, Jewish women inherently do not have this spiritual blockage. They are in tune with their spiritual soul, with their spiritual source. And it's evident throughout all of our history. As a matter of fact, when it came to the Jewish people in the desert, the story of the golden calf that we discussed a while back, we see this theme as well. When collecting gold for the golden calf, the Midrash tells us, the men first approached the women asking for their jewelry. They wanted to build a golden calf. They asked for the jewelry. The women stood up to them and said, never will we forsake our God who has just performed such miracles and might. God forbid that we should fashion an idol. When the men saw that the women refused to take part, they stripped themselves of the golden earrings that were on their ears. It does not say on their wives' ears, but rather on their ears. Unlike their male counterparts, the women experienced no blockage to the godly reality that was so spectacularly displayed before them the weeks before. They didn't have any spiritual blockage. They were connected with godliness in a natural way. They're not besieged with this spiritual blockage. So that's the first element of circumcision, to remove the spiritual blockage that we have. What's the second element of circumcision that expresses its essence? It must be performed on the 8th day. Why on the 8th day? Why not on the 7th or on the 9th? Or on the 11th or 15th or 4th? Simple, straightforward answer. is to give the baby time to be able to sustain this procedure. The problem is that we're taking away the advantage or the quality of consent, right? If you wait till the child gets older, 15, 20, 25 years older, then they have the ability to consent to the procedure. As a matter of fact, this discussion of doing it at 8 days versus doing it as a mature adult is a discussion that took place the first time we have circumcision. Who was the first one to be commanded with circumcision? Abraham, but he wasn't commanded just for himself. He was commanded to do it to his family and to his household. Who was that? Ishmael and Isaac, Yitzchak, the brothers, the two half-brothers. And they had this discussion. Ishmael was circumcised at 13 years old because that's how old he was when God gave the command to his father Abraham. How old was Isaac when he was circumcised? The command came about before Isaac was born. So Isaac was the first one to be circumcised at 8 days old. And the Midrash relates a conversation that took place between the two of them, between Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac and Ishmael argued, says the Midrash. Text 8, page 25. Ishmael declared, I am more cherished than you because I was circumcised at the age of 13. I'm an adult and I made a mature decision, a choice to go ahead and be circumcised for the Almighty. Isaac retorted, I am more cherished than you because I was circumcised at 8 days. What's the uniqueness of 8 days versus 13 years? 13 years, granted, we understand the importance and the specialty, and indeed it's very special when an adult decides to go ahead and be circumcised. As a matter of fact, there's an organization called Bris Avraham, the Covenant of Abraham, that's based out of New Jersey, that performs circumcisions on adult males who haven't had the chance to be circumcised at a young age. Sometimes men older than 70 opt for a circumcision. And primarily it's for men of the former Soviet Union where circumcision was prohibited. Many people did put themselves on line to go ahead and be circumcised under those conditions, but nonetheless, there were thousands upon thousands, if not millions, who did not have the opportunity to be circumcised. Nowadays, if I'm not mistaken, they've reached over 30,000 circumcisions that they've performed since the fall of the Soviet Union. So we understand the greatness of someone choosing to have a circumcision as a mature adult. But the flip side is such a choice creates a relationship with God that is limited to that individual's choice. It's a very limited relationship. Precisely by not having a choice, Yitzchak, Isaac, and all Jewish children following him enjoyed a relationship with God that's not dependent on them. It isn't dependent on them and their intellect. Rather, it's an unbreakable bond which transcends any particular behavior. It transcends anything natural or logical. And that is the significance of having circumcision on the 8th day specifically. What does the number 8 symbolize? The number 7 symbolizes nature and the repetitive nature, the repetitive cycle of nature. 7 days of the week, followed by another week of 7 days, and another day of 7, another week of 7 days for eternity. What does 8 symbolize? The 8th day symbolizes beyond nature. This supernatural relationship that transcends nature, that transcends our understanding, that transcends our being. This relationship with the Almighty, which is deeper and beyond nature and reason. Those are the two elements of Milah that express its essence. Removing the foreskin, which expresses the idea of removing the spiritual blockage that's inborn to every single person. And the 8th day, which symbolizes the supernatural connection that the circumcision creates, the relationship that the circumcision creates with the Almighty. Now that we understand a we have a deeper understanding of the mitzvah of bris milah, we can now understand why the Jewish people at the time of Exodus were commanded and instructed to perform it for the merit of their redemption. Where were the Jewish people spiritually at this point? At this point, as a slave in Egypt, it meant that they were steeped in a deep, deep level of impurity. Aside from the physical bondage, the physical enslavement, it was a spiritual abyss. It was the most corrupt land on earth. Being stuck in Egypt meant a spiritual death for the Jewish people, so much so that according to Kabbalah, the Jewish people were nearly at a point of no return. Kabbalah teaches us that there are 50 gates, 50 stages of impurity, and if God forbid someone reaches the 50th gate of impurity, that is a point of no return. Stuck in this depth of impurity for eternity. And that's where the Jews were just before. A dot, a moment before entering that 50th stage of impurity. And that's why we eat matzah. One of the questions we asked in the Manishtana was, why do we eat matzah, right? All nights of the year we're able, right? Shabachal aleilas, anu echlin chametz ay matzah. For those who remember, it was only a few weeks ago. We eat leavened bread or we eat matzah. Halayla hazeh kula matzah. But this night we eat only matzah. Why? Why, the child asked their father. Why? What's the answer that we give the child? We discussed the story of slavery. How does that answer the question of matzah? Here is the famed sage, the Shalah HaKadosh, the holy Shalah Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, the 17th century sage, who's known by his book, the Shalah, and he explains as follows. In the Haggadah we read, if the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children and our children's children, would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Explains the Shalah, this answers the question of chametz and matzah. How does this answer the question? And how does this tie into this idea of being a moment away from being in the 50th gate of impurity? Explains the Shalah. To explain, after so many years in Egypt, the Jews were nearly entirely subsumed into evil. They had already entered the 49th stage of impurity, and were they to remain in Egypt even for another moment, they would have entered the 50th and final stage, from which there is no return, God forbid. This then is what the verse states, and I redeemed you from bondage, namely the spiritual servitude of Egypt, and I did not allow the chametz to rise. Namely, the Jews were redeemed from the 50th gate of impurity. Chametz, leavened bread, risen bread, symbolizing the impurity, and matzah symbolizing the humility, the purity. Thus, between the words matzah and chametz is only a small dot. The broken leg in the Hebrew word matzah and chametz are comprised of the same three letters, mem, tzadik, and the third letter is the hey and the ches. If you look over here, the hey and the ches are almost identical. The only difference is that small space that connects the leg to the roof. That small dot that symbolizes that small moment. Thus, between the Hebrew words matzah and chametz is only a small dot, the broken leg of the hay, that sets it apart from the ches. This then is the answer to the question in the Manishtana, why this night is only matzah. The entanglement of the Jewish people was so deep that they required this extra powerful force for them to escape this otherwise endless fate of physical and spiritual subjugation. What was this force? What was this force that enabled them to climb out of this abyss, to climb out of this nearly lost moment? That was Milah. Milah, the performance of the circumcision, was the perfect antidote for it. It was a physical act that was filled with spiritual redemption. removing of the foreskin, which removes the spiritual blockage. This idea of connecting a relationship with the Almighty, which is beyond our rationale, which transcends everything. It's a deep relationship with the Almighty that proves our connection beyond any reason or logic, beyond nature. But the Jewish people didn't receive this mitzvah yet. They didn't receive the mitzvah of circumcision. So how is it possible for them to enjoy its redemptive qualities, to pull them out of this quagmire, to pull them out of this deep entanglement? And even deeper yet, a question, how is it even possible to change such a deeply ingrained spiritual distortion? And this is where it takes place. This is where the commandments to circumcise themselves at that first time, it came at night specifically. This explains our answer. You see, were nature to take its course, the Jewish people would have been permanently irredeemable. They would have hit the 50th stage and they would have never been able to come out of Egypt. That's were nature to take its course. But because of that, that's why God gave them the commandments to perform circumcision specifically at night. By specifically commanding the Jewish people to perform circumcision at night, God was providing the Jewish people a pathway out of Egypt. God was showing the Jewish people that in order for him to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, he was going to break this immovable boundary between day and night, even if it meant going against his own Torah. His own Torah, God says, do it in daytime. And what does God say? In order to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, I will bring circumcision specifically at night. Why specifically at night? Because God was telling the Jewish people that yes, you're in a deep darkness. You're in the night. You're in a place which is seemingly irredeemable. You're reaching the point of no return. But I'm going to reach from a loftier space where the limitations of darkness are irrelevant, where there's no day and there's no night. It's an outer worldly reality where pitch black night is perfectly equal to the brightest day. I am reaching from a place which is beyond, which transcends the order of nature, which transcends day and night. There's no day, there's no night. Do it at night, God tells the Jewish people. Perform circumcision at night, because this unbreakable bond that I am now forging with you, the Jewish people, through circumcision, although normally can't be done during the night, it can only be done during the day. I am showing you that if it comes from me, if it comes from my essence, which is beyond day and night, then even during the darkness is when this bond can be forged. The words of the Zohar. The Zohar describes the night of the Exodus. That night shone like a bright summer day. The entire nation saw the judgment of God was meeting out. This is the meaning of the verse. The night will light up like day. As darkness, so is light. Explains the famed 18th century sage, the Chida. This description implies that the earth was illuminated on that entire night like day. In fact, some commentators use the Zohar to resolve the difficulty as to how the Jews could circumcise themselves at night, because it wasn't considered night at all. Now, it seems to be behind the Zohar's assertion that the night shone is the language used by the Torah. The verse tells us it is a night of anticipation for God to take them out of the land of Egypt. This night is God's. How does the Zohar glean from this verse that the night shone like day? To explain, when discussing the creation narrative, our sages point out that as opposed to day and goodness, night and evil never appear in the same sentence as God. Therefore, as God's name appears here in our verse, in the description of the night, it must be that it wasn't really night at all, but rather it shone like the sun. It turns out then that the night of the Exodus had the qualities of both day and night, day in relation to Mila circumcision, and night in relation to Karban Pesach, the Paschal lamb which had to be eaten at night. Hence the verse, the night will light up like day. So what do we have here? It all fits in perfectly. This deep entanglement that the Jewish people were in, the only thing that was able to take the Jewish people out of it was circumcision. What lured the Jewish people to circumcision? Paschal sacrifice. But we have a problem. Circumcision happened at night because Paschal sacrifice happened at night. But circumcision has to take place during the day. The reason why God told them to be circumcised specifically at night was to prove to them, was to show to them, saying, hey, Jews, I'm reaching out to you from such a lofty space where the limitations of darkness are irrelevant. What does this mean to us here in 2021? And how does it circle back to what we spoke about in the beginning? Truth is, we don't have to look far. We said it in the Haggadah and we read it in the Talmud. In every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally left Egypt. So we have to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, and every aspect of Egypt is associated with our lives. What does Egypt mean? The Hebrew word for Egypt means also limitations, boundaries, constraints. So leaving Egypt is something we do every single day by breaking free of constraints, whether imposed upon us by others or self-imposed upon ourselves. But what if I feel stuck in Egypt? What if I feel in a place where I can't leave? It's beyond me. My cycle that we spoke at the beginning, I want to change. I want to become a better Jew. But I know I'm never going to be perfect. But I know that it's even if I start doing because I know that it's only going to be mediocrity. Why bother if I'm never going to be that perfect Jew? I meet people all the time that tell me, Rabbi, I'm a bad Jew. And we have that feeling all the time. How do we crawl beyond that? How do we leave our Egypt? How do we leave our Egypt? How do we tap into aspects of Judaism that feel unattainable to us? We have to see ourselves as if we are leaving Egypt originally, as if we are those Jews who are leaving Egypt originally, just as the Jews who left Egypt originally. Here they were. Let's put ourselves in their shoes. They're in the most spiritually, morally defunct country in the world. They spent over 200 years there. It permeated themselves. It permeated their souls. They reached a point, almost a point of no return. And yet God tells them what? Just do it. Do it and do it now. Don't think about what can be, how is it going to be, how is it going to be effective? Because this little mitzvah of circumcision, go ahead and do it. And if you go ahead and do it, that's going to change the course of everything. And what did the Jewish people do? They didn't let themselves get stuck in that cycle and thinking, hey, but if I do this, what does it matter? It's only a little thing. There's still 612 more for me to fulfill. And if I do that and I don't do anything else, then is this really worth it? They went ahead and they did it right away without thinking. They took their swords, as we read in the beginning for the Midrash. They grabbed onto the first opportunity they have and they did it. And the motto of Nike, just do it. They just did it. They went ahead and they did it. Action is key. Don't look at the daunting task that may be before you. Don't look at the eventual steps that you may have to do. Look at the here and now. The story of the circumcision teaches us, look at the here and now and just do it. What comes next, we'll deal with it next. And just doing it is not just a nice motto. It's not just a nice frame of mind. It's something which is meaningful because by doing each individual mitzvah, it alters the course of our trajectory. It alters the course of the trajectory of humanity. One single mitzvah makes us better To use that example of a diet, that metaphor of a diet, don't think about, you know what, what am I going to do in 3 weeks from now? I got a wedding I have to participate in. I want to enjoy that food. You'll deal with it. You'll cross that bridge when you get there. Right now, don't eat that donut. Even if in 10 minutes from now, you're going to go to a party and you'll eat something else. But you know what? That donut, it's a good act. You didn't eat it. That's good for your body. This mitzvah, don't worry about what's going to be next week or the mitzvah. If it's something which is you're going to feel like a coward. You're not going to be a coward. You're going to feel like a hypocrite. You're not going to feel like a hypocrite. It's beyond me. It's something that makes no difference. Do the mitzvah now. And do it as often as possible. Every time you encounter it, just do it. So the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, an interesting point quoted from Maimonides. We have found and noted a particularly great and incomparably wondrous virtue regarding charity when it is performed numerous times. That giving frequently is what is praiseworthy, rather than all at once, even when the total sum is the same. As the Rambam Maimonides wrote in his commentary on the Mishnah, the soul is refined by means of the multiplicity of action. The Alter Rebbe is teaching us something important, this exact idea. Doing a mitzvah is not only about the result, the sum, but about the act itself and the person doing it. As Maimonides writes, that each person has to look at themselves and the entire world as an equal balance between good and evil, and who knows which act will be the one, maybe this act will be the one that will tip the scales and bring salvation and redemption to the entire world. So Maimonides says, if you have an option to fulfill a mitzvah once versus multiple times, go for the multiple times, because it's the action that's key. And so what this midrash teaches us, what this story teaches us, what the mitzvah of Piecemeal teaches us, is this idea that when we feel incapacitated by this cycle, by thinking about what's going to be, don't let it get to us. Don't think too deeply into it. Just act. Do one mitzvah. You're going to light Shabbos candles. Don't worry. Is it something that you're going to have to explain to your friend and to your friend's friend of why you do it and how you do it? So I don't want to be a hypocrite. And right after I light Shabbos candles, I'm going to get into my car. So I'm a real hypocrite. So I won't light my Shabbos candles, or the same with tefillin, or the same with any other mitzvah. Don't think about that. Do the mitzvah now. You'll deal with those issues later. Right now, do the mitzvah. Just as the Jewish people did that circumcision in Egypt without asking a question. And it was that mitzvah that brought them holiness and brought them out of Egypt with a single mitzvah. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
And if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.